Hello and welcome to Kaleidoscope Live. We are the Kaleidoscope team from the British Journal of Psychiatry, and this is our first webinar of 2022. As you'll know, if you've been here before, every month we publish in a column in the British Journal of Psychiatry. We bring the best science to you, and we take a couple of the papers to the webinar each month. Please do join in by adding text at the side. So we have a couple of papers this month we're going to talk about. One is about medication in women, and the second one asks, does psychology have a physics envy problem? So the first paper, this paper is by Brand et al. It's in Psychological Medicine. And it might seem surprising, should we have special guidelines for women? After all, they only make up 52% of the population. But this paper says that, yes, we should. And it takes on in a few different ways that are quite interesting. The first thing that was really interesting for me is it challenges the standard epidemiological teaching around psychosis and gender. And the first part is it says it's not true, the standard teaching, that women necessarily have better outcomes in psychosis. And that was a standard teaching when I was a junior doctor and through most of my training. And it argues instead that more recent data suggests that women have just as many admissions to hospital. The trajectory over time is pretty similar to men, but there are some crucial differences, and these tend to involve medication. And so we're aware that men are typically bigger than women, but medication guidelines are based around a standard 70-kilogram man, and that's problematic. So if we look at the basic physiology, if you think about how medication is absorbed, how it's metabolized, and how it's excreted, this is typically slower in women. It's different between men and women, and what that means is if you give both the same dose of medication, the woman will have a higher dose in her bloodstream. And this is amplified by hormonal effects. So what we've learned with time is that estrogen in particular enhances the binding of dopamine. So if you've got a man and a woman and you dose them so they're the same serum level, so you took into account the difference in absorption, metabolism, and excretion, the woman would still have greater binding of dopamine because of the impact of the hormone on it. So that opens up the question, which the authors introduce, as that women are over-medicated by default with antipsychotics. So what are we going to do about it? So what do the rest of you think about the paper?
As the non-clinician of the group, can I just jump in? Because I read this and was literally just going through like, yeah, this all seems super reasonable. Yeah, oh, there's a difference here. We better respond. Okay, good. Turns out this is somehow controversial. This is somehow new, right? That quite literally estrogen, which immediately means pregnancy, lactation, menstruation, menopause, all of these areas require some sort of special consideration. They're just life. So how is it, with all due respect, that this has been going on? Like, how are we just quite literally ignoring the actual nature of the biology of women? Please enlighten me.
I'm not sure that I can enlighten you. All I can say is there's a lot of studies that are carried out in men that don't include women because people are concerned, particularly drug studies where people are concerned about the effects that that may have on people who might become pregnant. I think there's an increasing awareness that that's something that we need to fix. But in essence, people prescribe on the basis of the data that's available. So if you don't have data which is proportional or tells you to do something different in 52% of the population, then you just do what's in the trials. And for me, I guess there were things that I knew that, you know, you kind of think, okay, so females will have a higher proportion of fat, a lower proportion of muscle, may have smaller organs because of their size. And there was a bunch of things that I didn't know. So which was, I think, like there was a 15% increase in brain blood flow in females. That there is much higher bioavailability. And I remember reading the thing that Derek described about estrogen and its impact on dopamine sensitivity. So effectively, if you have high levels of estrogen, then you're much more sensitive to the impact of anything on your dopamine receptors. That includes blockade. And then the other thing that I didn't know was that they have a 15% reduced glomerular filtration rate. So actually their kidney excretion is that. And so the message from all of those things is that during that kind of premenopausal phase, women will tend on the whole to have much higher levels of medication for any given dose. And then how you get rid of that in terms of its metabolism is a slightly more complex, because the kind of cytochrome P450 system, which is used to kind of help the metabolism of a bunch of these drugs, actually is not consistent in the way that it performs across different antipsychotics. So that looks like it needs a little bit more thought. And then the other thing, which again is kind of obvious, is that in certain folk, we tend to use long-acting injectable medication. And that's generally something that's that is influenced by the amount of fat in the system. So basically, it's likely that that will influence the amount of absorption and release of those kind of medication. So for me, it was educational on the front that I didn't know about all of these physiological variables which are likely to influence absorption. And there were a bunch of things that I did know about, but I wasn't sure that it was at the forefront of my mind during my prescribing. So the period, to answer your question more succinctly, is the period when I am immensely concerned about the effect of these is when people tell me that they're thinking about becoming pregnant, or whether they've had a baby, and we're thinking about what do we do in terms of breastfeeding and these kind of very practical suggestions. And the folk who fall into the remit of the kind of the perinatal psychiatrists, where people have these illnesses which arise as a consequence of these rapid changes in hormonal balance. And we are concerned about how we can manage during that time, both with a concern around the baby, but also around the mother. And then I guess the other thing is that we are not particularly good at thinking about these kind of post-menopausal changes, that you suddenly have all of these hormonal effects, and then suddenly you hit an age and those will change. So I think the awareness of that actually there will be an influence if we follow this model, that we think we're going to require less medication during the pre-menopausal phase, then we may need to also anticipate the fact that during that peri and post-menopausal phase, you may need to adjust medication. So for me, it was a really good reminder about just not actually just sticking to the same practice that you've always done, but actually to focus on each person as a new arrival, and also to think about where they are in their trajectory, not only in life, but particularly in respect to their kind of hormonal balance.
Yeah, Suki, exactly what you were saying. In clinical team I used to work in, we would often see bimodal distribution of women presenting to services with psychotic disorders, and the second mode was women who were around the age of menopause. So we've had people who were approaching menopause, going through menopause, and postmenopausal, and it represented a discrete group of people. The presentations obviously weren't uniform, but there were certain similarities. And I remember going to two meetings where we discussed what can we do to better help this very clearly quite discrete cluster of patients. There was a prototype for that kind of patient, and we were scrabbling around looking for prescribing guidance on, for example, co-prescribing HRT with treatment for psychosis. And the thing that excited me about this paper, and I'm super enthusiastic about it and endorse it, because it's an area I don't know very much about. And when I was reading it, it just kept clicking, going, oh my God, that's exactly right. This is what I recall from the people that I've seen. So I've got that kind of bias in that I was looking out for this data and this evidence. And I think that the authors have done a fantastic job of describing the literature, describing and making recommendations that I really wish were in the standard guidelines, because they're super helpful and useful, and they address exactly the sorts of questions that we were asking about. For example, we would use risperidone for certain types of presentations, but always at way lower doses than you would predict from the guidelines, which says the treatment dose is 4 milligrams once a day. And we'd find that people actually would respond at way lower doses. But in addition to that, when we tried to use treatment doses or published treatment or recommended treatment doses, we'd find that people had horrible side effects, and quite quickly as well. So, going from 3 to 4 milligrams, all of a sudden we would have people experiencing unpleasant and intolerable side effects. So we'd very often be titrating up for that particular group of women in that particular age group. And the postmenopausal or the perimenopausal age period for women seems to be a risk for psychotic type presentations. And in addition, there was nothing to tell us what to do. There was nothing that personalized care for that specific group of people. So that my endorsement of this paper is just that every paragraph you read, you think, yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And they and in extraordinary credit to them, they actually give you specific guides. It actually reads like a treatment recommendation. So I've got nothing more to add to that than it's timely, appropriate, and it represents the best kind of evidence-based medicine. It helps us actually personalize treatment to the individual that's sitting in front of you. So
it's more than timely, isn't it? It's overdue. It's 2022, and we're having a discussion how we're fascinated that there's a specialist prescribing for a niche area, which is women, again for 52% of the population.
Yeah, there's a question. Sorry, Derek. I was talking over you.
No, and how it's perceived, it's almost been niche pharmacological prescribing. But one of the comments from Sahana, which picks up, I wonder if there's a complexity to it. So Sahana asks about adjustments in ovulatory phases or during menstrual cycles. So I guess there's a complexity to prescribing too. But I don't know if this is where it's gone into niche areas such as perinatal psychiatry or specialist clinics. And we know that in practice, these services don't really exist. If you think between obs-gynae end of medicine and treatment for menopause and so forth, and psychiatry, I mean, there's a huge gap in the middle, and yet there's a huge clinical need. Sorry, Dan, you were going to come in.
I was exactly picking up on that. There's a question in the chat I think you just referenced, which is dose adjustments in ovulatory phases and how practical that is. Well, I guess I think that question is really interesting. I read a paper a few years back that recommended, and by the way, this is not me endorsing it, I'm just telling you about a paper which said that, a short-term use of SSRI medications for mood dysphoria around the menstrual cycle was something that people were starting to either recommend or think about. So I think if we're, there's a precedent for this, that you should be able to dose adjust medications for people so that it responds to natural physiological fluctuations. I mean, we do that in a much more static way by saying, aiming for 70%, antagonism at dopamine receptors. We kind of titrate up to that. We know we've gotten to 70%. Okay, when the person starts to experience extrapyramidal side effects, and we titrate back, it wouldn't take more than about 6 weeks, or maybe 12 weeks, if you wanted to catch 2 ovulatory cycles. Then you would have some measure of a way of titrating the dose down when you have down or up in accordance to the amount of estrogen that the person's endogenously producing and exposed to. So it shouldn't be rocket science.
I wonder if we can pass this back to the non-clinician in the room, because I suspect we haven't reassured you, Dawn. And there's an interesting comment by Sierra here who asks, with all due respect, isn't this a problem in psychiatry in general, that we stop seeing people as individuals, as separate, but we're seeing in terms of doses? And I mean, that probably sounds a fair comment in terms of what's being discussed here.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm going to come from a slightly radical place, which is that going back to, I think it was Sahara's comment about how practical is this? Well, what if we switched our perspective, and what if we made prescribing in a nuanced way around normal biological processes in females, the more complicated case? What if we made that the baseline? Then everything's easier if men are the exception, right? So right now, if we're biasing, if we're using male as the default, then yeah, that seems really like impractical, really difficult, super complicated. And our organs aren't smaller, except unless you compare us against a default male. So I think there's a perspective missing here that actually, if you just reverse it real quick, everything becomes a bit easier. You have the capacity, you know, you have data. If we just said, nope, instead we're going to prioritize the more complex situations so that anything a little bit more linear kind of easily flows from that, it's a totally different practice, right? Or is it? I mean, I don't know. I look at that, I see default biases that we can't seem to get out of.
You're a genius. I think that's the way the drug development should follow that, along with ethics. Because I think you're right that the only way of resolving that is to say that we need, rather than say we need an equal number of different folk from different genders in every single trial that we carry out. Actually, we want to super sample the more complex female, and therefore that will make because the other ones are relatively uninteresting and straightforward. But I think that does require quite an effort of will in terms of slightly more complex designs, and asking some of the questions that Dan's raised in terms of how can we look at flexibility within those trial designs, where we can look for this titration rather than the current trial designs, which are very much here's kind of stream A versus stream B versus a control in a very, very fixed way. There's very little room in a lot of those trials for titrating up. There's certainly very little room for titrating down, because they're all based on one or two outcomes. So I think that there's a complexity in that needs to be addressed. But I think it's not insurmountable, even just starting it from the point of view of insisting that the ethics committees, which need to review every single one of these trials, will be to say that it's no longer acceptable not to have at least 52% of the sample as being female, even if you don't say that you're going to do more of that. And that will be a relatively easy way of implementing that. I have to say, I think that's slowly becoming much more accepted, that people are asking questions if you're suggesting that you want to do trials which are only single gender.
We discussed this on a previous podcast too. We're talking about the fact that it can't just lie with individual research teams. It's got to be journals and what they'll accept and the statements they put out and what's good science in terms of grants that are applied. I mean, I'm mindful we submitted a paper this morning that was a neuroimaging paper that was 20 right-handed men, and the science tends to perpetuate this stuff along, and the trials that occur are often starting off now. So to Dawn's point, it's the wrong way around. There's a question from Jesse. I don't know if you guys have time to simulate it. It's quite a complex one in terms of estrogen's effects on the brain. I'll let you read it while we go through. I mean, it is quite complicated. And again, I think this has been again, it feels to me it's felt a niche area, which of course it can't be if it's about most of the population. So Isaac's mentioned discussion is long overdue, the shortcomings of teaching of pharmacology. Yeah, and I mean, I think we like to think of ourselves as a group of people who are progressive in our thoughts, but I suspect we're highlighting the fact, the challenge at every level here, from academic through to teaching and clinical practice. And services are not set up for this either. So I work in an NHS trust. I think it's a good NHS trust, but we don't have services. Nothing is geared for it, unless you have you have to have a specific interest in this topic and take it on. So from designing the science to running the studies to submitting to journals to how we run our services, they're not doing due justice to our populations.
And if the consequences are severe and medical, and again, this really does echo the preclinical paper we talked about on gender balance previously, a couple of episodes ago, but you know, we're actually going against like sustainable development goals of gender equality. And if we're over medicating women because we're not taking their biology into account, it's a much broader thing. And I think Helen's point here around grant giving bodies and all of that, but really sort of owning it as urgent, I think it would be a super start, you know?
There's the whole, I can't answer Jesse's point, I'm afraid. It's not something I know anything about. I mean, the paper does speak to the idea that the prolactin or hyperprolactinemia effects that you get because of dopamine blockade around the pituitary, I think that's well recorded and well understood, at least as a clinical principle, but I can't speak to the idea of estradiol blockade and its effect in utero. Another question that's coming up is that speaks to Suki's point, was about, is there I think it's Nagina, my apologies if I mispronounce the G. Research might also be at fault that women have not been included. And that's a really good point, because men are considered safe trial participants because they cannot get pregnant. So I think that points to the regulatory and probably a certain amount of the business case for trials is that you don't want to be trying a phase 1 drug in a population, i.e. in women, where there's a risk of kind of a longer term, because women bear children, that there's a reticence to study that group of people, which is also the similar reason why we don't have any good data, or pharmacovigilance. We only have pharmacovigilance data, and we don't have any very good guidance on how to treat young people and children. And it's for exactly the same reason. It's because no one's prepared to take the risks associated with studying that group. So I think Nagina's made a really good point there. It's, women are excluded for a whole host of reasons that are institutional and structural, but also the pharma companies aren't going to be keen to study a group of people where they run the risk of exposing themselves to liability.
Oh, look, I'm glad Casey said this and not me, because I'd be accused of just centering this back on men and what about us too. But at the point's also made that we don't tend to take male hormonal changes into account either. And there are emerging data about testosterone as a potential treatment in some instances of men with depression, for example. It's really the whole field of psychoendocrinology, I guess it's there, but it's very niche and it's kind of taken in isolation. And Isaac, I think, mentioned it earlier on too, like it's back to your initial point, Don, it's not as if this is an entirely new concept about endocrinology. We've kind of known this back in med school a long, long time ago, but in terms of translating into practice and academic practice and in terms of clinical practice, it goes back to your comment. The paper is timely and in fact long overdue.
Yeah, someone else here, Vasily, and again, I hope I pronounced their name correctly. Would there need to be adjustments for the trans community? And I think this is a really good point. Again, we're talking in binary categories of men and women, but maybe the point here is that you have a hormonotype, which is a longitudinal characterization of how the spectrum of hormones in your body behaves around different cyclical periods, if cyclical at all. But that's sort of the idea of personalization, is it doesn't necessarily matter whether you want to talk about men or women. What you need to talk about is the biology that person experiences and presents with, right? That's what you really need to be doing. So I take that point on board. I think that's a really good point. And I think it can be answered by looking at the idea of having a description of the person's biological predispositions and not focusing so much on men and women.
Logistics are important. So I think Helen's asked about where do you apply influence to make sure that happens? Because I think if you just leave the system as it is, you'll always go down the path of least resistance and avoid complexity and avoid risk, because that's just intuitive. So I think the points, I think for me, the overarching thing is that all of our medical practice, particularly in psychiatry, needs to be personalized for that individual. And all of the variables that are likely to influence the illness and particularly the treatment trajectory are things that we need to consider. So that's basically this is asking for. This is essentially saying that there are hormonal variations, there are variations in phenomenology, there are variations in the epidemiology. Even the age of onset of schizophrenia is later in females than it is in males, and that's a relatively consistent finding. So there's all of these, the facts that we know, which allow us to personalize our care. But the issue for us, I think, at the moment is that the quality of the data that we have to make those decisions, to personalize that care, is probably not quite where we want it to be, which then moves the question to, well, how do you get better quality data coming through the studies that you're doing? And those, I think, you're looking at kind of mandatory levers. So the people who are giving the money, and this is Helen's point, what about grant giving bodies? The people who are giving that money need to be aware of the fact that this is something that's important, and the people who are designing the studies need to have an expectation, and the people that this will be designed with this population in mind. And then the people who are looking at the ethics and the kind of morality of what the process is should be aware of the fact that it is unethical just to do studies in one gender, because it's not going to be helpful in terms of personalizing across the board. So I think actually it brings out quite a lot of different themes from that one kind of observation that things are different based on hormone changes.
I think this is the most unified we've been about any paper we've spoken about on these webinars. So I'm going to leave the last comments in this paper to Nazreen and Sahana, which kind of sum up what we've been saying about this greater need for personalization and precision medicine, which I think we all support. And Sahana mentions then about adolescent population. So this clearly it's going to be changes there too. Okay, we're going to change tack onto a second paper. This paper is from the journal Perspectives in Psychological Science. It's called The Conceptual, Cunning and Conclusive Experiment in Psychology. And Dan, you're going to tell us that psychology has physics envy.
No, I'm not. Just to be clear, this paper excited me. Yeah, I introduced the term physics envy because so I think someone on Twitter described it that way, and I like the idea, right? And the papers about this, it's they talk about I think the psychological sciences is a better way of saying it. So this would include, any scientific endeavor that aims to explore or explain, human behavior, as noisy and as messy as it is. I don't think it's certainly not an anti-psychologist paper at all. It's actually I think quite a clever deconstruction of the way modern psychology does things experimentally. And it sort of exposes how the dominant philosophical paradigm for generating hypotheses, generating experiments, and then then analyzing the results of them is flawed. That's their point. We've got an entirely wrong model. So this is the way I understand the paper, and I'm not a philosopher of science, so it's, my enthusiasm for it should be tempered a little with, I'm not a philosopher of science. But Ernest Rutherford once said that there was, if your experiment needs a lot of statistics, you should have done a better experiment. So the idea is that you shouldn't need to use lots of sophistry to get to the answer that your experiment was designed to prove. And De Bruer and Rossell's paper says that there's something called the Hypothetico deductive approach to science, and it derives from physics. And the example they use in the paper, which is a really good one, I think, is Arthur Eddington's expedition to Brazil for the solar eclipse in 1919. The reason it's prescient is because Einstein had published his theory of general relativity about 4 or 5 years before, which said that light from distant stars will be bent as it traverses from the star to planet Earth. It will be bent as it goes around the sun. So the solar eclipse is perfect for that, because light from a distant constellation would have to go around the sun, or it would intersect with the sun. So they could actually measure that. So Einstein predicted, I've written the number down here. Okay, Einstein's theory of general relativity predicts that the change in the angle as a result of the light being bent around the sun will be 0.000483 degrees, right? That's precision for you. Now that theory predicted that. So all Eddington had to do was go and measure, before the eclipse and after the eclipse, the positions of these stars on a photographic plate. And all you have to do is measure that a number of times, just so that you're sure your measurement error is relatively narrow. So the only uncertainty that you need to accommodate in the analysis of that experiment is whether or not you're just getting small deviations as a function of your measurement error, right? That's how they proved that theory to be, or proved or demonstrated that theory was supported by evidence, right? Very rigorous theory, okay. The theory was consistent with other theories, although it contradicted some of them. It had a consistent theoretical family around it. It made a specific quantifiable prediction. It wasn't just there will be more of this or less of that, we don't know which direction it's going to be. It said it's going to be this number, okay, and then you have to go and do the experiment, and that's it. So that's what the paper describes as cunning experiments that surprise you because they work so well. And their argument, or De Bruer and Rossell's argument, is that's because in physical sciences, the predictions that you make are strongly connected to the hypothesis is strongly connected to the theory, and the theories are well connected to each other. So when you find a piece of empirical evidence, okay, you're not just supporting you're not rejecting your null hypothesis and then saying, so any other hypothesis could be true. You've got a very strong prediction and you're trying to quantify the effect. You're not trying to say, as we often do in psychological sciences, you're not trying to say there will be an effect and it could go either up or down, and we'll just do two-sided t-test to decide that, right? You're actually looking not for a direction of effect, not is there, isn't there. You're looking for a discrete number that you already know the value of, and you're trying to confirm it. So that's their argument. That's hypothetico deductive science. They're saying psychology can't cope with that because fundamentally, if you take an observed human phenomena, and they give a load of examples in the paper, the great one being the Wansink paper about the soup bowl that keeps filling itself up. So the participant will keep eating without knowing that the bowl's filling up. And that became hugely controversial because, of course, it was proven to be complete bunk, and the results were fudged. Now, their argument is this, is that if you set up you can set up a null hypothesis, there will be no difference between group A and group B, where group A are exposed to one set of stimuli, group B are exposed to an orthogonal set. If you reject the null hypothesis, you just say it's bigger or smaller, and usually with one of those awful p-value tests, right? So you can hypothesize that your theory could be that God intervenes and or ESP is the reason that people perform this way in experiment. You can come up with any theory you want, okay, but you'll only frame that as rejection of a null hypothesis that there's no effect. So I show there's no effect, and therefore the default is any arbitrary theory that I've put at the start of my paper to justify this experiment. And that's the bit that caught my attention, because I thought, well, that's really elegant, and that kind of explains why we often find ourselves looking at papers like the Wansink study or the Zimbardo study on conformity in social psychology. What was the other one? Oh, the Rosenhan study, where people presented themselves to psychiatric hospitals, got admitted and diagnosed. All of these kinds of things don't lend themselves to a strong marriage between theory, hypothesis, prediction, and result. Okay, and because of that, I think the argument De Bruer and Russell are making is that you have to go back almost like behaviorism. You have to go back to cataloging examples, of inputs and outputs without trying to hypothesize some elaborate mechanism in the middle. The physics envy part comes from this trend that I think we've seen in a lot of scientific work. I think psychiatry is vulnerable to this too, is if you make something complicated, you throw a ton of mathematics into it, you throw elaborate complex models, boxes and arrows, you come up with a very elaborate theory, your reader is persuaded that that's pretty cool, and then when you show you can reject the null hypothesis, therefore all of this rubbish I've just told you is true, you're super persuaded by it, because it's like, wow, it took me a lot of intellectual effort to get my head around it, it must therefore be true. So I thought this, and Suki, years and years ago, you recommended Freakonomics to me, and I read that book like in one sitting. And the reason was every chapter is like, wow, isn't that counterintuitive? It must be true. When things are counterintuitive and surprising, you're more persuaded by them. So that's why this paper really struck a chord with me, because it says that all of these cunning, exciting, surprising results are probably false positives anyway, right?
Can I ask two things about that?
Yeah.
So one is, I get the point about sometimes studies not being well designed from a psychological or a psychiatric perspective, and also trying to dazzle with science. But I found that the comparison with physics, I'm not sure if it's valid. So physics, we're all aware that physics can seem quite complex, but sometimes, you get a big enough telescope, it's really just a measurement problem, and it's easier to do in physics. So they work to a 5 sigma rule, right? So you need to have a p-value 1 in a million false positive, but that's just so that it's easier in physics to do some things. The second is a question to our viewers. Or one of the psychology experiments that's cited is the one where a gorilla walks by in the background that people notice. I'm curious if anyone saw Dan's cat walk behind him while he was talking. We were doing live science there. That was done intentionally. Dan's cat is the highest paid member of this team. Has anyone else got any comments on that? Not the cat, but the science bit.
Derek, I think to follow up your point, your first point, not the point about the cat, although that was a beautiful invisible gorilla moment, right? Sorry, Derek, you'll have to repeat your first point. I've forgotten it. Sorry.
I just wonder if it's slightly disingenuous, the paper's point, not yours.
I see.
I get there's an argument about how well constructed experiments are, how we can be dazzled by a p-value of 0.05 if it's well designed. And we've done other papers on how a good graph can win someone over. But I think the comparison to physics isn't necessarily fair. So physics, large experiments can do measurements on scales that are not possible in biological sciences. And we get dazzled in a different way. So you could never do a 5 sigma experiment in a biological science that I can imagine. So I'm not sure the comparison with physics is directly fair. I think there's the core argument to me is about good design in biological and behavioral sciences.
I think I agree with you. The comparison probably isn't fair, but I don't think to defend De Breuer and Russell's paper. Yeah, and again, this is my understanding, so I'm defending it on the basis of my probably flawed understanding. It's not that they're saying that physics has got it easy because, right? What they're saying is the very method of designing or coming up with an idea for an experiment in physics, yeah, is guided by the idea that the theory will make a quantifiable prediction that you then go looking for experimentally. Whereas that hypothetico deductive approach is not appropriate to psychological sciences because you don't have a general theory of relativity, yeah? Because you don't have that and there's not a mesh of theories around it that support or refute it, you can't then go and design a super precise experiment that says, when I fill a soup bowl by exactly 10%, yeah, you will see exactly 1.75 spoonfuls difference in the amount the participant consumes. Yeah, because you cannot make those kinds of links from your theory to quantitative predictions. Instead, we resort to what they call in the paper statistical whitewashing, which is where we say, well, the effect could be it goes up or down. So we'll just look for a qualitative effect of more or less. Yeah, and that's their point, is you can't move you can't use the hypothetico deductive approach. Yeah, a cunning experiment derived from an elaborate theory won't work for psychology. I think that's their point. And they sort of, one of the examples they gave that I guess is slightly relevant to psychiatric work is the elimination of the category of homosexuality from the DSM, where they said the reason that happened wasn't because of some elaborate hypothetico deductive principle. It was simply people just went away and studied the population prevalence of the question or the subject of investigation, and it became clear that it should not be pathologized. So that's a slightly obtuse example, but I think their point is we should spend more time cataloging examples of where a phenomenon is visible and the context in which it's visible, rather than taking complex human behavior or phenomena, isolating it to a really controlled lab experiment that would never have ecological validity or would generalize beyond that lab, and then whitewashing the result with some funky statistics. I think that's their point, is we should perhaps spend more time cataloging the world around us and less time designing experiments from a basis that we have a strong theory.
I don't
No, you go ahead, please.
No, so the only thing I wanted to add, I'm not sure that it's quite as binary as you're making it, in the sense I agree with Derek. I think what they're suggesting is you just need better quality experiments, and they're just trying to describe essentially what you've said, Dan, is kind of narrow, sexy, high impact, not very generalizable to real life studies are not the way to go, but finding theories that you can test which are a bit more real life, understanding the factors that influence them, whether they're cultural variables or whatever else they may be, understanding where they work, why they don't work, and adopting this kind of more parametric design rather than kind of fail yes, no of a hypothesis, making a theory which will allow you to grade the amount of change that you're expecting to see is the way forward. So actually is the way forward in our experiments is actually to be much more sophisticated and be a bit braver. And that necessarily requires you to be able to link the theory to the hypothesis that you're testing, especially if you're making quantifiable hypothesis, and will then is much more likely to have an impact and that is generalizable to other situations because you're just doing more robust science. They also make the point to say that they're not saying that you shouldn't, that our research won't benefit from us being much more strict, like using proper p-values with corrections for however many comparisons you're doing pre-registration. They describe that as being honest, that you put up front what you're going to do to stop what Dan described as the whitewashing process post hoc, and also just to be more diligent, that don't expect that you need to be able to replicate your studies in different labs, in different environments, in different cultures, just to show that what you're describing is a robust thing. They also argue for, rather than showing simple relationships between two things, using some understandable mechanism like kind of mediation analysis to say, we expect an effect that this will have an impact on this variable to this extent. So you can actually test those kind of things explicitly. Just before we came on air, we discussed the fact that actually we discussed the Dora Declaration. So if you attend a grant body, one of the things that they're very clear about is that the grant giving bodies are all signatories to the Dora, which is a declaration on research assessment. In essence, what they're saying is, is what Dan has said, do not be influenced by sexy, narrow impact papers which may be published in particular high profile journals, but actually read the paper, see what the value of it, and understand how that will generalize what it means to you and your scientific community. So they're very clear that when you're judging people's grant applications and their CVs, that you should deliberately ignore the journals that the research is published in, because they're saying there's no index that will not add value to your assessment, and we want you to deliberately exclude that from your assessment and do it on its merit. So they're saying, don't be seduced by this high impact, narrow, sexy kind of science.
And of course, behavioral science will tell us that having you swear that you won't is in no way going to get you around your cognitive biases, but okay. I've got just a couple of points. They're completely random. Number one, honestly, this moment in time has completely channeled like the pub table during my PhD, really getting kind of into a topic. And I love that so much, that sort of playing with what it is that we're doing, the meaning of it. I feel like there should be a pitcher of beer, and next we're going to do the mind-body problem, you know? But I think these are really joyful moments in science, because we really get to step outside of ourselves and outside of our expertise and talk about the meaning or lack thereof of what we do. So with that, it was a great pleasure, actually. Thank you, Dan. And then the next thing is around a couple of points to actually wrap it back to the paper we've just had. So the first, I sort of wonder if, in the same way we haven't been kind of expecting women to be men, have we been expecting psychology to be physics or whatever? Like, why does it have to be the same to be valid? Why does it have to in any way look the same? And I think the other point of that is, the only reason that it is because that is rewarded. So we have to change the structures of publication, right? We have to change the structures of grant funding if we're going to really say this different approach to valid science is in fact valuable. And it's a funny thing, like, I'm not a purist in any way in terms of scientific methodology, whatever. I'm entirely too practical as a human for that. And I can remember a million years ago when microarrays came out, and a whole genome didn't even fit on a chip yet, but we had the opportunity to basically grind up some brain, put it over a chip and see what happened, you know? And it was so exciting because it wasn't hypothesis driven, it was data driven, and there was power in that, you know? And I think it's brought areas of focus that we can then begin to go and look at. And some of them were rubbish, but some of them were amazing targets to pay attention to. And I think with that said, this idea that everything has to be the same exact approach to science that we've had for hundreds of years is maybe not serving us. And in fact, actually, what we could be doing is limiting ourselves. They make a nice point in the paper about this idea of layers of information, and how I would argue, you know, physics often does not in any way impact the way that we look at marketing. And yet there's photons of light and vision, right? We somehow, we allow for there to be a stratification across these layers, and we're not bothered by that. And we see stratification within any kind of science of the mind, right? Because nobody is complaining to neuroscientists that they haven't solved the manifestation of the internal emotional dialogue. Like, nobody's fussed about that. But psychology, you need to step it up. I don't know. So I think that we've got to maybe question and reflect on, why does we put these expectations in certain layers? why it is we allow them to be absent in others, and where we might be missing opportunities to actually join up. That's it. It looks like we're ending. Apologies, everybody.
And Estelle and Nagina also talk on that too, about examples of good science and how we can follow through from that.
Yeah.
But what I took from you really is we need to do the next Kaleidoscope Live from the pub to enhance our discussion. But I have to say to people, I don't know if we can bring Dan's cat along. I appreciate that appears to be the major draw for most people here today, but we will do our very best. But thank you for joining us, and we hope we see you again next month. Take care.
Bye, guys.